Hello, welcome to another installment of the Intel with Greg Cosell on the Inside the Birds platform. I'm Jeff Mosher with my Inside the Birds co-host Adam Kaplan, and joining us on this great episode, as always, from NFL Films is Greg Cosell. And Greg, in this episode, we turn the page. We've done NFL free agency. We've recapped a lot of the Eagles free agent signings. Now we turn the page to NFL draft preview. We know you've been in the lab. So we wanted to start with you, the position, right? The position that there's just, so many names to go through, and we're going to have you do what you do best in the business, which is break it down and just bring it to life for all of our viewers and all of our listeners. Wide receiver is a darling position in the NFL, and this happens to be a year where there's a lot of really good wide receivers in the draft, at least a deep draft, a lot of scouts will say. Let's start right off the bat. There are generally three receivers you hear talked about a lot as guys who are right there, top 10 talents. And that's obviously Marvin Harrison Jr. of Ohio State, Rome Odunze of Washington, and you hear Malik Nabers of Clemson in that group. So of those three, how do you see it? Do you agree it's three? Is it fewer? Is it more? What do you see?
I mean, again, you get caught up in sort of these finite distinctions. I would say that to me, it's probably top two. You have Harrison from Ohio State, Nabers from LSU. Odunze to me would be a notch below. Still a really good prospect, but I would have Harrison and Nabers as my one and my two if I had to make a list.
And give the compare and contrast between those two.
They're totally different. That's the cool thing. Let me just ask Adam
Sure.
a quick question, because he's, he goes to the owners' meetings every year. He gets a vibe from a lot of this. Adam, is there a sense, when I watch receivers, and there's so many this year, and there's going to be more and more every year because of the nature of college football, is there a sense that in the NFL you shouldn't pay receivers a ton, even though they are getting paid? Is there a sense that, hey, you can always get receivers?
I would say the latter is true. You could always get receivers, but the thing is with the speed of these guys and the explosion, like we'll talk about Xavier Worthy later, but the bottom line is it depends how the traits and how they separate each other. But from a salary standpoint, it's why the Chiefs had a number that they were going to pay Tyreek Hill, and when he wanted over that, they traded him. On your point, they found other ways to run their offense. Where most people thought, oh boy, this is going to impact it. There's no way they can win a Super Bowl. The point you made has been brought up to me.
I'm not agreeing or disagreeing. I'm just trying to get a sense of that, because this is such a deep receiver class. And my sense is you're going to see that more and more. Again, I don't work for a team. I'm not a scout in a strict sense, so I don't know what next year's class looks like, which scouts teams look at, or the year after that. Teams look ahead, as you guys both know. So I can't speak to what next year is going to look like, but it just seems to me that you can get receivers. Now, again, I'm not saying you're going to get, Justin Jefferson every year, so maybe there's a few that you say, hey, we have to pay. But, I find it interesting that someone like Tyler Boyd hasn't signed at all yet. Not that he's a superstar, but, is there a sense that you can get a Tyler Boyd in any draft? And this is no knock on Tyler Boyd, by the way, who's been a very productive and quality player in the league.
Yeah, no, to answer the conversation, I would say, just based on people I speak to, Greg, I think that there's no confusion between the three names we just mentioned, like the superstar talents, and a guy in the third round. But once you start to get to that cluster level, I'm sure teams look at what they have and then what they can get in the second or third round, and probably don't see as much variation, because then it's about your quarterback, your offensive system, where this guy might slot in for you. So you bring up a good point on Tyler Boyd, though, who has generally played the slot in his career. And people do sort of look at that as more fungible than, say, having a premier outside receiver.
Right. Anyway, I just thought I'd bring that up because I know, Adam's, at the owners' meetings, and we, and then he has his conversations. But anyway, look, Marvin Harrison, we don't need to spend a lot of time on Marvin. He's a really, really high level prospect. I mean, you got to remember that he's a legit 6'3". He's about 210. he's so fluid that it looks like he's not moving. And, people kept saying, what's his speed? What's his speed? And we don't have a time speed because he wasn't at the combine. And by the way, he wasn't at the combine, not because he didn't feel like going. He was doing an internship that he felt obligated and compelled to finish. So if you talk to people, they'll tell you Marvin Harrison is as great a kid as there is. His work ethic's off the chart. He's incredibly humble. He's not one of those guys that didn't show up because he didn't feel like showing up. Right. But right. This is a guy with great size, high level athleticism and movement. He knows how to run routes. I mean, obviously, we know his dad is Marvin Sr. He knows how to attack and break down corners. He knows how to release versus press. He has multiple release ways of doing it. You're just dealing with a guy that's a prototypical number one with size, speed, hands, body control, explosiveness, physicality. I mean, to me, he's the top wide receiver in this class. And again, I don't want people to think that I'm saying Harrison's a 10 and everybody else is a 2. That's not my point. Mm-hmm. I just think based on what I've seen on tape that I think Marvin Harrison's the number one wide receiver in this draft class.
So then you would
hard to disagree.
Yeah, and you would put Nabers, I guess, as the next best guy. How does
I would?
And
I love Nabers.
I spoke to someone who actually, and this, you're going to get this all the time, right? The variants we talk about, the chocolate, vanilla, sure, whatever. I had spoken to a longtime scout who likes Odunze most out. He loves them all, but he says if he had his guy, he would take Odunze. So how do you?
Yeah, do you want me to talk Nabers or Odunze then?
Yeah, break them down, compare and contrast. What do you think each one does?
Well, Nabers, I watched Nabers last summer from 2022, okay? And this was when he sort of just burst on the scene. And I remember watching him last summer thinking, this guy is really, really good. And then, of course, he had a ridiculously good year this year. I mean, this guy's played outside. He's played in the slot. Some people see him more as a slot than an outside guy, believe it or not, but he can play both, in my opinion. I think he's got a complete receiver skill set. He is physical. I mean, his lower body is like Debo. I mean, his run after catch reminded me of Debo Samuel. He just has such a strong lower body, which allows him to do something that is not thought of, and it's often overlooked. He has the ability to stop. So when he runs those routes that require a receiver to stop, he can do that. And a lot of corners can't stop the way he can. So this guy, to me, he's a high-level prospect. He's great run after catch, probably a better run after catch receiver than Marvin. And he's just incredibly physical and tough and competitive. I think that he can work all three levels of the defense. He's got tremendous physical traits. Nabers is a guy that, I really, really like as well. I mean, like I said, I would probably have Marvin 1. Malik would be, 1.11. I mean, he's really good. And by the way, I could see, depending on your scheme and how you want to deploy receivers, I could see some teams liking Nabers more. And again, I like Marvin more, but I could see teams liking Nabers more.
So Greg, I had a coach tell me he would be a Z receiver. He would not line him at X. He just didn't see him that way. Is that?
I could absolutely see that. I could absolutely see that.
More of a movable chess piece kind of guy.
Yeah.
Over the years, is there anyone who might compare it to him, like just on the top of your head, or does he just kind of have a unique style of play?
Ooh,
tough one.
In some ways, and you just asked me a question I hadn't thought about, so I'm just throwing,
sure,
I'm throwing it out right now.
Yep.
In some ways, he's like a bigger Steve Smith in terms of physicality and toughness, and run after catch, take no prisoners kind of attitude. And I just thought of that right now. So, I mean, I'd have to think more about that, but that name just came to mind. Obviously, he's bigger than Steve Smith, but I think there's a competitive physicality to Nabers' game that's somewhat reminiscent of that.
I'm really glad you said that too, because the scout that I spoke to, who's done this for a while, who told me he likes Odunze out of all of them, told me he felt Nabers, and he didn't mean this disrespect. He meant the way you're saying it. He thought Nabers would be best in certain schemes as an explosive slot, which he didn't think about the other two. So that's really that's fascinating.
There is a feeling by some that he's much more of a a slot type. Or see, that's why what Adam said, I agree 100% with, and that obviously came from speaking to someone. I could see him more as a movement Z or a slot, whereas I think Harrison is a boundary X.
Got it. All right. So let's
And I
move.
think people will think of Odunze as a boundary X as well, by the way. Odunze 6'3", 212. I saw him talk at the combine. This kid is super impressive, by the way, just incredibly impressive kid. And I went up and introduced myself to him just because I was so impressed with the way he spoke and, his whole manner and I spoke to him for a minute and a half. Okay. So I'm not going to sit here and say I know Rome Odunze, but there's just something about the kid that is really, really impressive. And that's what I've heard from everybody. He's got size. He's got great hands. I mean, he has exceptional hands, and he can catch the ball away from his frame. He's got the ability to sort of contort his body any way that you need to contort it in order to catch the ball. With receivers like this, you always wonder about the ability to separate. We had this conversation a couple of years ago about Drake London, although I think Odunze is a better prospect than London, but there are some similarities in their game. I think that he's kind of smooth and fluid, but I wouldn't call him explosive. But in this league at Boundary X, where you're going to have to make a lot of tough contested catches, he can really do that. And he can track the deep ball exceptionally well and make catches, even if he hasn't created a lot of separation. And in this league, as we know, that ability to make contested catches cannot be overstated. We know, particularly when you're a Boundary X, just so people understand what that means. It means you're the single receiver to the short side of the field, very often on the back side of trips. In other words, there's 3 receivers to the strong side, the wide side, and there's 1 single receiver who often gets man coverage. The way the league has evolved in terms of coverage, that receiver often gets single coverage. So you have to win, and there's multiple ways to win. Guys can win different ways. Odunze is just a physical marvel in terms of that. I mean, he can contort and he can catch.
So moving on to some other interesting names here. The next guy was Nabers' teammate. That's Brian Thomas from LSU. What are your thoughts on him?
Brian Thomas, to me, is going to be an ascending player. I mean, he was a fascinating watch. I mean, this guy is long, and you could tell from the tape that he could run. So, look, his 40 time was ridiculous given his length. He's 6'3", 209, which is actually the same size as Marvin Harrison. And this kid ran a 4.33. And his overall, his athletic measurables are kind of off the charts. I saw him as definitely an ascending talent. I think he's long, he's smooth, he's got accelerating speed, he's got stride length, he can get on top of corners. There's no question he's a vertical dimension. He seemed to always find an extra gear when the ball was in the air. And I remember having this conversation. I've had it many times over the years with Mike Quick, that's what it's really all about. It's the ability to sort of add that gear once the ball's in the air. And there's not a lot of guys who can do that. Some guys are just straight line fast, but nothing changes. It's just they're just fast at the same fast speed the whole way. It seemed Thomas seemed to have that extra gear, extra burst when the ball was in the air. He's incredibly fluid. Guys that big, it's often hard to call them sudden and explosive, but he was such a glider. I mean, that he was deceptive. I think that he's got home run ability. He's got size. He's got stride length. I believe there can be more to his game. I think he's going to be a really good receiver. It may not be year one, but I think this guy is really an ascending talent, and I think he'll be a really good receiver.
Excellent. All right. By the way, I misidentified Malik Nabers, I think, from Clemson when he went to LSU. So thank you for that.
Yeah.
Let's talk about a receiver who may be a little bit different. You said there's multiple ways to win, but McConkey from Georgia, right? Watched him at the Senior Bowl, Greg, had some really nice battles against some pretty good corners. And what stuck out to me was his route running. How do you see McConkey?
Yeah, I mean, he's got to get stronger. There's no question about that. But this guy he was so much fun to watch. When you talk about route running, that's a term that's thrown out a lot. Mm-hmm. Basically what you talk about when you say a guy's a good route runner, and we're talking obviously mostly against man coverage, whether it's press or whether it's off, particularly off. If it's off coverage, what you have to try to do is you've got to get the corner, you've got to get him off his spot, and you got to get his body turned. If the corner can just kind of sit there, never get out of his pedal, then he just reacts to you. McConkey was a master at sort of the subtleties of and the disciplines of route running, how to use his vertical stem to attack and set up corners, get them off their spot, get their bodies turned. Then you can defeat their leverage. There was no wasted motion or steps in his route running. I mean, this guy was just a really, really good route runner. I think people were probably surprised he ran a 4.39, whatever that means. But his 20-yard shuttle at his pro day was off the charts. It was 4.04. So, I think, like I said, he has to get stronger. He's going to face some press. Although, again, you deal with an NFL now where there's so much more motion, there's so much more formation variation. You take someone like McConkey, he's not a boundary X. He's not going to be lined up where there's going to be corners right in his face. He's going to be a movement player, So, again, the ability to get off press, yes. Does he need to get better at it? Probably, but that's not the way he's going to play in the league. So I really, really liked his tape a lot, and I'd be curious where he gets drafted. I mean, you hear anywhere late first to second, but to me, he's one of those guys that's going to play in the league, and he's going to be good. He may not be top 5, top 6, but he's going to be good.
He strikes me. Adam, I was going to say, he strikes me as a guy who would fit really well with a Shanahan-McVay type of offense with that movement ability and that interior, foot lateral quickness.
Yeah, and it's funny, and I'm going to say this, and of course this is all people are going to remember, but I'm so used to that. All people remember is if you make a comparison, that's what they say, and then they tell you're an idiot, and that happens to me all the time, obviously. The more I evaluated McConkey, the guy I thought of was Cooper Kupp, and again, Cooper Kupp coming out of Eastern Washington. That's what I'm being clear here. Cooper Kupp coming out of Eastern Washington, small school receiver. He ran a 4.62 40 at the combine with a really bad 10-yard split, okay? McConkey ran a 4.39 with a good 10-yard split. So McConkey kind of reminded me of Kupp. Now, we know Kupp has gone on to be great, and he won the Triple Crown a few years ago. But I'm talking about coming out of Eastern Washington. I remember being at the combine, as I'm sure you guys do, when he ran a 4.62, and people start to look at each other and go, oh, man, now this guy's going to be a 5th-round pick. So that's sometimes when I evaluate guys, I think of them when they're coming out. What happens in the NFL is a function of many different things, including the individual. Obviously, we know Cooper Kupp is one of those guys that has a ridiculous work ethic. I don't know enough about Ladd McConkey, although I've heard really, really good things. But that's what I'm speaking about. It's McConkey coming out of Georgia versus Kupp coming out of Eastern Washington. That's the way I saw it.
So Greg, when I went to the Senior Bowl, I was given a list from some coaches to keep an eye on. They mentioned McConkey. So I'm watching practice, and my mouth dropped. His short air quickness was the best that I'd seen. So I happened to see the receivers coach who put me on him, and I said, do you see Cooper Kupp here? He goes, yes. That's the guy you should think of. Well, and that was a couple months ago.
Yeah, and again, so now it depends where he goes. I mean, obviously, McVay and the Rams have as great a pass offense in terms of schematics of any team in the league. So, Kupp becomes I don't want to say becomes a great, maybe he'd be great anywhere, but he becomes a volume player. And that's the way we think now. Yeah.
Is he a slot guy only? Is he
No, I don't think he is, but I think he's going to have to get a little stronger. But I don't think he's a slot, just like Kupp's not a slot only. It all depends on the scheme. With all those reduced splits, don't forget with the reduced splits, even if you're number 1, you're only 4 yards from the tackle sometimes. And so it's, even though you're number 1, it's kind of like a slot because it's such a reduced split.
All right, let's go to the great state of Texas, Greg, as they say. You got two really good wide receivers, Adonai Mitchell, or A.D. Mitchell to some, and of course Xavier Worthy, who set the NFL Combine on fire with the sub 4.3 40 that he ran. How do you compare and contrast both of these wide receivers?
Oh, well, they're totally different. It's funny. Here's what I typed in my transition. I said he blew off the Combine with his record-setting 4.21 40. But his tape from both 2022 and 2023 told you he was fast, so that sprint time did not add anything to the evaluation because we know he's fast. He could have run a 4.27 and we'd be having the exact same conversation. He's fast. And I think he's more than fast, though. I think he's a really interesting guy. Obviously he's got vertical ability. We don't need to spend a lot of time on that. But I think he's a little more than that. I think there's some toughness to him. and again, now he's a guy that it comes down to how he's going to be deployed in the context of an offense. And don't forget, each year there's guys who come in the league and they sort of expand the thought process. I mean, look at what Tank Dell did last year, okay? Because Worthy's 5'11 and a quarter, 165. But he, as I said, he's got speed. I wouldn't say he ran a ton of routes, but there were strong examples in which he showed some nuance and detail running intermediate routes, especially naturally coming back to the ball. And very often that's kind of a natural thing. You can teach guys that, but sometimes guys either can do it or they can't do it. So I think he's a really intriguing guy. Again, he's going to be a function of how he's deployed, because at 165, obviously you don't want him in a position where he gets pressed, but he can run and he's a little more nuanced as a receiver and he's got some toughness to him. The only thing that would concern me is at the catch point, he's not necessarily physical. Like Devonta Smith, who's the same weight, he's more physical at the catch point. We've seen Devonta Smith in the NFL go up and get the ball and make contested catches. I'm not saying Worthy can't do it, but that's not on tape.
How would you describe his deep ball tracking? Because if you're going to be that fast and that light like Deshaun Jackson, you're probably best if you're a good deep ball tracker.
I think it improved significantly from 22 to 23. I mean, it's an absolutely necessary trait for guys like Worthy, and I think it's gotten a lot better, and it needs to be good. That's an absolute necessity for Xavier Worthy.
Sure. Okay.
What are your thoughts on Mitchell?
Now, Mitchell's a fascinating guy because he's all over the board in people's minds, because I've had a lot of conversations. I really liked him on tape. Now, he's another one of those guys that it just has great size. I mean, this guy ran a 4.34 at 6'2", 205. His athletic testing measurables are off the charts. He's got size. He's got a strong, solid frame. He's got really good hands. He caught the ball away from his frame. He ran a lot of in-breaking routes at Texas. And to me, that's something you always want to see, because past games in the NFL have to work the middle of the field somewhere along the line. You can't just work outside the numbers. And I thought he worked the middle of the field effectively using his size. He's got short area quickness. He showed some burst. He's more of a speed cut guy, which doesn't surprise me given 6'2", 205. He's not necessarily a drop his weight, sink your hips guy. But I think that he has the traits and attributes to be a boundary X. He can win one-on-one on the outside at all three levels. Now, I know I've been told, I don't know this. I didn't meet him and talk to him for 10 minutes at Combine, believe it or not, in one of the hotel lobbies. And I was really trying to impose upon him the idea that it's all in the details. It's all in the work, and again, I'm not going to say I know him after talking to him for 10 minutes, but if he accepts all that and he approaches it the right way, I think he's got traits to be a top 10 or 12 receiver in the league. But
wow.
I've also heard some other things that are a little concerning. So, again, we'll see how that all goes. I don't know if you guys have heard anything, but but the tape, I think the tape's really good.
Interesting.
Excellent. All right, we move into another stage of wide receivers here. Troy Franklin from Oregon, Greg. How do you like him, or do you like him is the question.
Yeah, he's specific because he's very straight line linear, but he can run. See, you get a lot of these tall receivers now who can really run, and that's the way it's kind of moved in terms of receivers. You have a lot of tall receivers this year, and Franklin, he's one of those guys because he was 6'2", but only 176 pounds. So he's an intriguing guy because he can run. What he did at Oregon was mostly vertical stuff. I mean, he did catch, in breakers as well, but he has accelerating speed. He can run by and get on top of corners. The question is, can he effectively defeat physical press coverage at the next level? Can he work through contact without route disruption? Can he make catches, where he's contacted? Those are questions that you have to ask. At 176, can he be a boundary X or not? My sense is he won't be seen that way. But he was a pretty static receiver in the Oregon offense. he'd have to learn how to be a movement guy. But I think that's probably the way teams will see him. It's hard to be a true boundary X at 176. Doesn't mean he can never line up there, but at 176, that's a little hard because a boundary X, so people understand it, is on the ball. So the corner can be literally right in your face.
Greg, the next guy, I don't want to call him polarizing, but I've gotten so many mixed reviews on him. And though he had a great Senior Bowl, that's Roman Wilson from Michigan. What are your thoughts on him?
Yeah, Roman Wilson's an interesting guy. I think he's another kind of straight line-ish guy. You know, I thought a little bit like a maybe a Tyler Lockett type, you know, somewhat similar. How he has been deployed, you know, in the Seahawks offense, both as an outside and slot receiver. I think Wilson could be seen as that guy. You want him really to get free access into his routes. He's got really good speed, but it's build up, accelerating speed. That's kind of foundational to his game. I think he's a combo slot movement Z type guy. I think that he needs the pass game scheme to work to his strengths, reduce splits, motion, movement, those kinds of things. He's more straight line fast than sort of loose, sudden, and twitchy. You know, he's not elusive. He's kind of linear. But he's really smooth. I mean, he can run.
So a different type of receiver, Greg, from South Carolina, Xavier Leggette. Watched him at the Senior Bowl. Thought he did a really nice job using his body, big, strong frame to make contested catches, was good in the one-on-ones in that situation. There are some people who feel he can be a second-round pick. How do you sort of evaluate the whole package of Xavier Leggette?
Yeah, he's a fascinating guy because of the body type. You know, I watched Leggett, and there were times I thought of a Deebo Samuel. There were times I thought of DK Metcalf. I mean, just body type with, you know, sort of a mass, firm mass. You know, he's not a slim guy. He doesn't look like that. He's straight line explosive. You know, there's some areas he needs to improve, and there's others he probably can't because they're part of his body structure. He's much more stiff than loose. That probably won't change because of the way he's built. That at times limits his ability to change direction fluidly, which again is one reason he's best running routes that are more straight line linear, you know, movement routes like crossers, like inbreakers, like overs, like verticals, you know, routes where he just, you know, can move that way, where he doesn't necessarily, you know, he's not a sink your hips, get in and out of your break kind of receiver, but that's okay. Not everybody is, but he's got great straight line speed. You know, when he run after catch, I mean, he's got some juice run after catch now. There's much development needed to become a complete receiver. I don't know if he's a wide receiver one. We'd have to wait and see on that, but you know, you want to get him the ball in an ideal way on the move because he really has that accelerating juice.
Greg, the next guy, as we go back to the Senior Bowl, I was able to see, and he was really good, and that's Ricky Pearsall, who started his career at Arizona State, then he finished at Florida, but he had a great week. What are your thoughts on him?
Pearsall was a guy I really liked his tape, and you know, again, he's probably going to be all over the board for some. You know, I think that he turned out to be one of my favorite receivers the more I got into his tape and evaluation. He lines up outside. He lines up in the slot. Many might box him in as a slot. I believe that with the expansion of NFL pass games, he can line up in, you know, multiple spots. He's 6'1" now. He's not a little guy. I kind of thought that he had a good feel for how to use his vertical stem. He had body feints. He had head movements. I thought he did a really good job of giving his quarterback indicators of where to throw the ball, because you have to give your quarterback something on routes, you know, whether it's with your foot, your head, you have to give him something. You know, so I thought he was a pretty good separation generator with his plus quickness at the top of his route stem. He's got great hands to catch away from his frame. I thought he transitioned really seamlessly to run after catch when he caught the ball. I kind of liked him. You know, I'm going to be curious to see where he gets drafted. I kind of liked his tape.
Greg, speaking of curious, a guy who's a little bit polarizing in his own right would be Florida State's Coleman, who, and this may be a first for me to ever see, a guy who doesn't run a very good 40 at the combine, 4.61, but then blows it up in all the in the short shuttle and the other stuff to the point where he was among I think the leader in it. So how do you reconcile what you've seen on tape there with how he tested?
Yeah, he ran the fastest gauntlet time, and that
Right.
got people excited because his 40 time was bad. It was 4.61. It's funny. Obviously, I watched all his targets. Everybody has this sense that all he did was make contested catches. That's not true at all. I mean, he made a few, but it's not as if, wow, this guy's just a contested catch machine. He did show good hands at times with the ability to snatch the ball away from his frame and to make those tough catches. People probably remember one catch he made against Syracuse, which was ridiculous. He just went up with one hand and snatched it like it was a rubber ball. I mean, it was crazy. My sense is there's more to unlock with Coleman. I think there's a looseness within his body that needs to be developed. It may take some time. It may not happen. Who knows? But his size, he's 6'3", 213. That can help compensate for some of the limitations you see on tape. But there's something there. To me, now it becomes coaching, team, scheme, all those, the kid, I don't know the kid, all those things come into play. Didn't love his tape, but there's something clearly there within him.
Going back, Greg, to the Senior Bowl, one guy, when we look at guys down the line, because you never know in this league, some guys who people forget about, they want up being players at the next level. But Malik Corley from Western Kentucky, we saw at the Senior Bowl. What are your thoughts on him going forward?
Yeah, I mean, I thought he was a bit of a projection. Obviously, he wasn't at the combine. I think he got and he couldn't show up. He was predominantly a slot and motion receiver at Western Kentucky, so you didn't really see him run a lot of routes. Now, I don't hold that against guys because, that's college. A lot of guys don't run a lot of routes. He would need to learn to master the kinds of routes that he'd likely have to run in the NFL because, basically he just ran screens and crossers and shallow crossers. He's a solidly built kid. I think he's a little stiff, but he's got accelerating burst and speed. Can he work outside as well as the slot? Because, he's almost 5'11", he's 215, so he's not a tiny guy.
Wow.
So maybe he can, play both. I think he's probably a slot and a movement Z. Let him generate speed, let him generate velocity. You didn't really see him make contested catches at Western Kentucky, so can he do that? I think he's got a chance to develop into a strong slot Z receiver who brings a physical, competitive dimension to the passing game. I think he's that kind of guy.
Greg, let's go to Florida, Central Florida. Javon Baker. What do you see in his tape?
Yeah, he was originally a 4-star Alabama recruit, so he transferred from Alabama to Central Florida. Really interesting guy. He's over 6'1", he's 202. He didn't run a great 40, but there's something about him as a vertical receiver. He's kind of got accelerating speed. He's not one of those guys that you just watch and go, man, that guy can run. But it seems like the further he runs, the faster he gets. And there were really good snapshot examples of him being really detailed and nuanced as a route runner. You didn't see a ton of it. Central Florida doesn't have that kind of offense, but he showed the ability to kind of manipulate his route tempo, his stem path, to separate at the top of his route stem. I was a little bit fascinated with this guy. Now, again, we're not talking about a top 40 pick. It will likely take some time, but I think this guy can develop into a quality NFL wide receiver in an effective complementary role. You're not going to talk about this guy as a big time number one, sure. But there's a lot of these kinds of guys in the league that are complementary receivers that kind of run good routes, get open. They're not necessarily explosive or sudden, but they're really important to passing games.
I feel like I remember you saying something similar about that to like a Khalil Shakir coming out of Boise, was it? Where you thought he could be a good compliment right away, and as he develops, and he's developed in the Bills offense fairly well. He's made
and this year you'd probably expect him to be more of a higher volume target. Now, again, what that means we don't know, but there's a lot of guys like that. They're quality receivers. They're not great. So, you don't think of him that way, but then it comes down to the offense. I mean, if we were to pull up receiver stats for this year, there'd be a lot of guys we'd say, man, they're not great. I mean, look at Nacua, okay? Take nothing away from Nacua. There's not one person in the NFL, and you guys know this, that would say Nacua, if you just look at his physical traits, that would say he's a top 5 talent.
Right.
No one would say that, okay? But yet, he's in a great scheme. He does certain things really well. The scheme helps him a lot, and he put up ridiculous numbers. And he may do that. Who knows? He may do that for the next 5 years. But you're not going to have a conversation about Nacua with Justin Jefferson and Jamar Chase and receivers you're not going to have that conversation.
Right.
No question. Just one more thing. The other 2 receivers from Washington, Jalen Polk and McMillan. Do you like those guys at all?
Yeah, unfortunately, I've heard some really bad things about McMillan from coaches, which I don't know that stuff because I really like McMillan a lot. I did him last summer, and because he was hurt a lot this year, and I did him this year too, but I did him last summer.
Okay.
And I got to tell you, when I did him last summer, and by the way, just getting back to Odunze, I thought Odunze improved dramatically from 2022 to 2023, because when I did both those guys last summer, I kind of liked McMillan, in a similar way to Odunze, but Odunze really improved, and McMillan was hurt a lot this year. He's got really good length, McMillan. He's smooth, he's fluid, he's a strider. He's got deceptive route and play speed. So therefore, at times he could be a vertical threat, even though he's not purely fast. His 20-yard shuttle time for a guy 6'1", almost 200 pounds, was really, really good. So I like McMillan. And then Polk is a physical receiver who catches everything. You can probably line him up outside, but you may see him more. And this was a guy I mentioned earlier when we just started talking. It wouldn't surprise me if teams see him as an inside guy, kind of like a Tyler Boyd-ish type receiver. But I mean, I think there's a little more vertical ability there, just because he has great hands and he's physical and so competitive at the catch point.
Greg, I want to ask you about a guy who has some very famous bloodlines, and that is Brendan Rice, son of Jerry Rice. Brendan, a USC receiver. And what really jumped out, as we know he'll take a visit to the Eagles, is 12 touchdowns on 45 catches. That's a pretty good ratio right there.
Yeah, I thought he improved too dramatically as 2023 progressed. The question is, can he win versus really quality man-to-man coverage? I think he showed better short area quickness and burst, allowing him to get in and out of breaks with more juice as the year progressed. And that's a critical trait, obviously, if he's going to be successful in the league. The guy who he reminded me of, and I thought this guy would be better in the league, and he did have moments. The guy he kind of reminded me of was Van Jefferson when he came out of Florida, because Jefferson was really kind of an advanced route runner. He looked like he could separate really well, and he's had moments in the NFL, but it just hasn't quite worked out. But both had kind of a refined sense of route running. They understood how to attack corners. Rice has really good size. He's got strong hands. There's a physical component to his game. I wouldn't say he's explosive. Those traits usually find a place in the league, but he'll be a complementary piece more than a foundation.
Nice.
All right. Great stuff there, Greg, as we rounded out a lot of wide receivers, a lot of pick your flavor type of guys. I mean, built differently.
There always are.
Yeah.
Yeah. And it's team and scheme specific in many ways, because, with the exception of a few, as it is in most drafts, there's very few that are just scheme transcendent that can do anything. So it comes down to where guys get drafted, what the scheme is, who's coaching them. So many factors go into this, which is why guys get things wrong sometimes in their evaluation. Because again, sometimes I see a guy a certain way and he gets to the league and he's not used that way at all. And, maybe I'm wrong and it's great the way he's used, or maybe he doesn't turn out. And I think to myself, well, I didn't see him that way. I thought he should have been deployed a different way, so you never know. But there's so much that goes into it.
There you go. All right. That's going to do it for the first NFL draft preview edition this season of the Intel with Greg Cosell. Wide receivers in the books. Can't wait to be back with you guys next week for our next positional preview. So for Greg Cosell and Adam Kaplan, I'm Jeff Mosher. You've been watching the Intel with Greg Cosell.